Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the Public Works Podcast. My name is Joseph Blackman, and today I got a real treat for you. His name is Len Wright, and he is a civil engineering professional with Witt O'Briens in beautiful Colorado. Len, say what's up to everybody.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. I'm glad to be here. Super excited to talk to you today. Yeah,
Yeah, man.
it's a lot of fun stuff to talk about.
Good stuff, good stuff. Well, let's go ahead and get right into it. So, civil engineering professional Witt O'Briens, kind of give us the 30,000 foot view of what Witt O'Briens does, and then talk about what you do. Like, what's your day-to-day activities?
Sure thing. Yeah, no, happy to. And I realize Witt O'Brien's is not a traditional engineering firm, so some of your audience might not be familiar with them. Uh, Disaster recovery and response in a nutshell, with some other skill sets and service lines, I'll say, in terms of grants management and funding for projects. And so there's a funding piece, and then there's which is a significant part of our work. And I can talk to a little bit how I can help support that, but also disaster response and recovery. So mitigation funding before the disaster, and then response and recovery after the disaster. And in that context, Witt O'Brien's employs a wide spectrum of talent and skill sets, engineering being just one small slice of that. And so I'm a subject matter expert in water resources, public works, water, wastewater, drainage primarily. And so civil engineers are called in to help recovery efforts, whether it's to define damages, or in my case to envision what the future might look like in terms of some of our planning and design skills that I bring from the consulting engineering field. I've only been in the disaster response recovery for about 6-7 years. Primarily, I'll say. I've had other flood and drought work prior, but more traditional.
Okay, okay. Just some questions, follow-up questions. You're a subject matter expert, and I appreciate that. I respect that. But how can one become a subject matter expert in disasters? In disaster
Yeah.
recovery, because you have to go through a lot of disasters to become an expert. It's not like something where you can create every day and say, I
That's
figured
right.
it out. So tell us kind of the path of how you became a subject matter expert in disaster.
Yeah, that's quite a journey, actually. I guess it's a parallel track. There's one that would be maybe the traditional civil engineer. I went through a accredited program, went to work in consulting. I was working in combined sewer overflows in the Northeast and Syracuse and New York and some other, places in New England, kind of traditional urban drainage, sanitary engineering. Um, in that line of work, I started doing a lot of computer modeling that included floodplain delineation. Let's just keep it at that. Kind of traditional FEMA flood insurance studies and things of that nature. Then on to graduate school, I started studying at the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, which was a multidisciplinary research, applied research center, where I was sort of the token engineer. I was working with geographers and economists and sociologists, and everyone was pointing the finger at engineers, saying, "Oh, you guys, really mess things up here." I was like, "Wait, no, that's not the case at all." But I learned the perspective of how applied technology can be perceived, and at times, right, it's a justified criticism that some of the solutions that technology has brought forward have ended up with unforeseen consequences, right? I think floodplain management would be maybe a primary example. And I was lucky enough to work at, like I said, the Natural Hazard Center, which was established in the late 60s, early 70s by a geographer by the name of Gilbert White. And he's a fascinating individual who has a long history in floodplain management, really defining that term and what that means. But showing how some of the technological solutions of flood control really didn't diminish damages or destruction. And in fact, in some cases, enhance capital investment in places where it shouldn't be, where land use management, maybe a simplistic but illustrative example would be a park in a floodplain instead of an apartment complex behind a levee, right? The levee gives a perceived level of safety, but it will be exceeded, right? Every engineer will say, well, that will be exceeded. But it effectively increased capital investment in a location that put people at risk, bottom line. And there's plenty and plenty examples of that kind of case where, well, if we had managed, from that simple example, land use, that population wouldn't have been at risk if that was a baseball field, right? Yeah. So this is a circuitous answer, but I was following along, the traditional civil engineering path, but seeing these problems from a new viewpoint, right, from geographers and economists, and then experienced some disasters and worked in the response of some disasters. I'll point to the 2013 floods in the Front Range of Colorado, which were quite devastating and intense. And my house actually was flooded, so I was, personally affected. But I also worked for a consulting firm in Boulder, which was flooded, and we had, several response and recovery assignments as part of that, and I learned a lot. And I guess I didn't realize how much that was going to launch into the next phase of a career, but I took a few twists and turns along the way. But I had a large network in the disaster field as a result of that work in Boulder. And Witt O'Briens called me in 2018 as they were just getting engaged in the Virgin Islands in response to the hurricanes Irma and Maria. And there was water and wastewater damage to those systems. And so, one of the individuals I worked with at the Hazard Center, who was an anthropologist, remembered me. I hadn't heard from him in 20 years. He found me on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, Len, we need someone like you in the Virgin Islands." And so I started that engagement in 2019 to help guide really the whole, water, wastewater, and part of the drainage work for the islands of St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And that's still ongoing. We're still working on recovery and, taking it, we'll get into this, but, from response and into recovery. And now we're getting into traditional engineering planning of public works. So, funding projects for replacing failed infrastructure in the water, wastewater in the Virgin Islands, which is desperately needed. I mean, they were underfunded and, had a lot of problems even going into the hurricane. And so there was a mandate from Congress specific to the Virgin Islands to look at what if we applied industry standards for public works, for water, wastewater, to the rebuilding process. So we don't just replace what was there exactly, replace in kind, but what if we applied mainland codes and standards from an engineering perspective and rebuilt better and hopefully more resilient, and the next hurricane will be less damaging is ultimately the goal.
Yeah.
So I guess to get there, it was a back and forth. The short answer is, I kept my 1 foot in engineering, but I was also involved in this both personally and academically in this field of disaster response and recovery, which was a little unusual maybe for a traditional civil engineer.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you see these hurricanes going through the Gulf or through, the Caribbean, they're coming in hot from the Atlantic Ocean, where does your brain go? Do you think, oh, shoot, our infrastructure is like 150 million years old. we're not going to be able to, withstand this hurricane or this tropical storm. Or do you have like a small Rolodex of people you can reach out to say, hey, have you thought about this, or have you tried this, or call me if you need any help, or kind of what do you do? Because you're sitting in Colorado, there's not too many natural disasters there. Oh, you were? Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have, there's been blizzards and there's been some tornadoes in the eastern plains, and drought for sure. Currently I sit in the mountains of Colorado, and so the upper Colorado and water management there for drought is significant, and wildfire is a really bad. I'm very actively involved with wildfire recovery right now. But in terms of the hurricane story is actually interesting, because I was sitting in my office as a consulting engineer in Broomfield, Colorado, when I saw the news in 2017 of Irma Maria, 2 Category 5s that hit the Virgin Islands, 1-2 punch within days of each other. And I remember thinking, because I had been to other islands in the Caribbean, like, wow, Cat 5s, the amount of vegetation that gets blown over I was thinking more of housing and buildings, which was significant, no question. My mind didn't immediately go to water and sewer, though, which was kind of interesting. So that was really an enlightening experience for me to get into the data with the really hardworking, public works utility folks in the Virgin Islands. They are some hardworking folks that are working on a shoestring to keep those systems going. And so it was really enlightening to see how their operations worked before, when they saw that they were going to get hit, what the water, they fill the water tanks and get, everything, make sure the diesels fill and all that kind of thing. And then the recovery and response, but what the system performance looked like afterwards. So I guess, in terms of the Rolodex, it really was linked in, and it wasn't me reaching out, it was them reaching out to me, saying, hey, you have a background in disasters and wastewater, could you come down and take a look and just see, given the policy that, between, FEMA and the public policy that was written really by Congress in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 specific to Irma Maria, gave a new set of rules for FEMA to work with for that recovery effort. Given this, is there opportunity here? And that's what we did. We helped build a team that looked at it and say, yeah, there's in midst of this disaster and really traumatic stories when you see the video and hear the stories of people hunkered down for days and some of the devastation, but to then turn that to an opportunity really was kind of interesting and still ongoing. It's a lot of work, a lot of work going into it, visioning what a stronger island recovery, a stronger island infrastructure to help future recovery efforts. I think that's really what we're doing day to day right now.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's kind of dive into the backstory of Len, because I always like to know what made the superhero. Like, who was Bruce Wayne before he became Batman? So give us kind of from your high school graduation, what your career path was like to be able to develop yourself into the person you are today.
Yeah, interesting question. I had an interest in the outdoors. I was growing up in upstate New York, a lot of camping in the Adirondacks and hiking, and I knew that the environmental work in some sense appealed to me, and I was good in math and science. My dad was a professor at the business school at SUNY Albany, and he knew of a very particular program at Syracuse associated with Syracuse University, but it was part of the State University of New York system. And it's a school with one of the longest names. It's the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. It's a small school that sits right next to Syracuse, and you're really part of the Syracuse environment culture, but you pay state tuition, bottom line. So he was thinking smart, he's like, this is a great school, and he had gone to Syracuse, so he knew all about it. So anyway, I ended up in a program that doesn't quite exist anymore. It's morphed a little bit, called forest engineering. And forest engineering really was a conglomeration of civil, agricultural, mechanical, and there was only a few programs in the country in forest engineering. It was accredited, ABET accredited, to get a PE and everything. There's one in I haven't looked if these exist. Montana State, Syracuse, and Yale were the three that I knew of, and they really were designed back in the day for forest product extraction. You design, roads for skidders, and drainage systems and ponds for forest. I took classes in silviculture and dendrology. We were for real like forest stuff, but also a lot of civil, lots of civil. By the time I went through, most of the students, graduates, were getting into consulting engineering more on the urban systems. There really wasn't so much forest piece of it, and so I think they changed the name. It's environmental resource engineering now at Syracuse. But regardless, it was a broad program that was accredited in engineering, and I went to work in Syracuse for a consulting firm that did urban drainage. And I really liked math. I was doing modeling, and I stayed on for a master's degree there. And so, I really wasn't doing the forest stuff, but I was applying, obviously all the hydrology and hydraulics and all the things that I learned in school. So that opened the door, though, to this, I'd say, a continual theme of how the built environment and public works interact with the natural environment, both in the input, in the midst of the infrastructure network, and of course the output and the byproducts of our social systems. And so that really was a continuing theme throughout, I'd say, is, you can study the natural watershed, but then when you start to extract water and put a reservoir in it, and then put a town in it, and then put a wastewater system, and then put the effluent, and then guess what? There's a city downstream, and they're extracting water from your effluent. And guess what? There's a whole lot of biology in between too. And society values the fish and the ecology and the interaction. So there's always this sort of dynamic tension between, what we value as in the natural environment, and, how we use, as a society, water, and give it back to nature, and then use it again. It's a cycle, and I think to recognize that is very important. So that's, I guess, a nutshell from, I guess, you started at high school. Had an interest. There was definitely some periods there where I was lost. I won't, it's not like I had this vision of, oh, I'm going to be, sitting in Colorado, talking about hurricanes. There was definitely some periods there where I really didn't know. I thought maybe, that junior year of engineering can be pretty tough. And I was like,
Really?
I don't know. I made it this far. I might as well finish it out. But there was a couple weekends there. I remember junior year, I was thinking about, I don't know, I might have to make a change here.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, okay. Well, in your current position, I always like to talk about skill sets. Like, let's say somebody younger, they're fresh into the industry. They want to be the Len Wright one day. They want to be you one day. And they ask you, they say, Len, what would be the main skill set I should pick up to be successful at what you currently do today? What's that skill set?
Without any question, and it's a skill that I really didn't get in school, I will assume that, you're going to get a technical skill set. I mean, I'm an engineer, so if you're in an engineering program and you like it and can suffer through those tough classes, but it's communication, without a doubt. I could
Okay.
not speak like this, like I'm speaking to you at all. And I could not do a public, I was petrified, honestly, of speaking. I was always good at writing. I guess I'd say I had a good skill set in writing. And that was picked up pretty early in my career that, oh, this is an engineer that can actually write. So that was valuable. But then to then take that to verbal and be able to communicate, and this is really important because engineers like to talk to engineers, but no, you have to talk, to policymakers. You have to, talk to boards of utilities. You have to speak to regulators and permittees, and there's a wide spectrum, and they don't all know your you have the technical know-how, what's right and what's wrong in a very tiny box, small box, right? But it's a big world outside that box, and you have to be able to articulate what's relevant inside that box, inside your sewer system. What are the drivers? Why are you worried about clay pipes cracking? you know to someone who's on a board, but they're not technically engaged at all. So it's communication without a doubt, and verbal and written, no question, back and forth. And at the same time, you might need to go to you might have me on the other side of the table, and I might ask some pretty tough questions. So you need to be able to stand and deliver, because I also have an academic background, and you know, academics, rightfully so, will challenge each other to get to better science and applied science. So, I always say communication, and I see that as sort of this superpower for especially young professionals. If they can communicate, they move fast. They pick it up,
I,
and and you can
yeah,
ask questions, and you have the ability to say what's wrong and what's not working in your world. If you can't communicate that, your manager is not going to just be able to read your mind. So
true. So
it's
true. So true.
100% communication. And I know that's sort of an obvious question, but or answer to the question. Uh, but and in this modern world with technology, we obviously have a lot of avenues and tools at our disposal to facilitate communication, but it still comes down. You need to talk to people and understand where they're coming from, and
Yeah.
listen. Yeah, I guess maybe
Sure.
that's probably the secret power of communication is listening, right?
Yeah, which is it's it's a tough skill to acquire. A lot of us, we want to talk, 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 talk. We want to be heard, be heard, be heard, but sometimes you just gotta shut up and listen.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
still working on that one.
Nah, you're good, Len. All right, it is story time. I need a story from Len when something went wrong under your watch, what you did to fix it, and then what lessons you learned from it to apply to your future career.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I know. There's a long list of things that have gone wrong, and or different than you planned, let's say. And I think maybe that is the theme that I would hone in on, and to answer this question, because there's a long list of, there's project things, and oh, this person didn't do that, or we thought it would be this and it's that. But there's a great quote, and it's actually from Dwight Eisenhower, and I found this in sort of researching how I explain planning to a utility, actually a water and sewer district here in Colorado. And I remember finding this quote, and I said, it's so good. I have to latch onto this. And I might get the wording a little bit wrong, but and I think he said this in the aftermath probably of D-Day and World War II, but something to the effect of um, plans are useless. Planning is essential. And what I love about that is that nothing always goes according to plan. There is always extraneous factors, unknowns, but you have to go through the process of here's our variables, here's our starting conditions, here's where we want to be. We have some vision of the future. We look out the window today and we see what it looks like, and we say, well, we have a vision of it's going to be something different. Of course, getting from A to B is not going to follow the path that you plot out. But in order to adapt along the way, and I think that's the key concept, is to keep sight of your goal, but you might end up going down a path over here that's going to take longer and it's going to be more expensive, and you need to be able to, adapt and communicate, of course, of what that means to get there. So it's the go through the planning process knowing that that's not going to be the way it goes down. And so there's like a whole spectrum of probably examples I could probably try to drum up, some that didn't always work out, but
yeah,
there's always a lesson there, and that's the key also, is to always have a feedback loop. So how can I improve this process for next time?
Gotcha. What does Len do to get better and better year after year after year? You could just put your feet on the desk and say, I've seen it all, I've been through it all, I know it all. But what keeps you, or what do you do intentionally to keep learning, to put new and valuable information in your brain?
The only thing is that I'm never satisfied with what I know. I always want to learn more. And so that's what these things kind of feed on each other. If I said communication earlier. Well, if I want to learn, and communicate with you, I want to learn something about you. You have a cool truck behind you and it looks like a cool camera gear. And so I don't know anything about it. I want to learn about that. And so that's really it. It's really just learning, and I also know my limits. There's certain things that are essential to my work function. I'll say GIS as an example. I've never been good at running GIS software. I get it. I always have great experts that can help me in my, decision support planning for water resources. But that's where I say I'm not going to learn that. I just know I'm not going to be good at that. So it's know my limits, but then within what I'm interested in, always learn. Just there's always more stuff. I don't know a fraction of what the world to know, even within water resources. There's every day there's always more, either on the science, there's pure science. I deal a lot with the water budget, and soil moisture is a fascinating topic in the hydrologic world, and I'm continually learning about how that sets up pre-fire conditions. And then I get into disaster response and recovery with a flood after a fire. So post-fire flooding is a big theme of my work right now outside of the Virgin Islands. And a lot of it comes down to, some of the fundamental science of the soil moisture setting up the conditions for fire, which is really interesting. And I'm not an expert in soil sciences, but I glean enough in the water resources world to know that and in the context of climate change and a warming environment, especially here in the arid West, it's really interesting because that's a big reservoir of water that is getting depleted, and it's highly nonlinear. Meaning that there's thresholds below which vegetation just, and so there's really interesting things to learn. I'm still learning a lot, put it that way. So that's really all it is. I might have a few gray hairs, but I'm probably learning more now than when I was 23, to be honest.
Gotcha. Okay. When you explain to somebody what you do, what do you think they think that you do? Like, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about, your line of work, your jobs, your projects you work on?
I think probably most of, my friends and family outside of my, technical world think of pipes and pumps, where it's actually a lot more financial and economics and social systems. And, I really get into benefits. A lot of the project planning that I do has to make sense. This vision of the future, we're going to expend a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of manpower, a lot of that energy goes into it. What's the spectrum of benefits that, this life cycle, this infrastructure life cycle will accrue? And do they make sense, in the context of the community that they're serving? So I think it's probably a lot broader than what people think. But I'm not an expert in sociology or in economics or in geography, but I know enough of those fields of how they influence public works, infrastructure, water resources, that there's really important knowledge and context that comes from that. There's some really interesting ones. I can tell you the Virgin Islands, again, they have, their water history of water use, and, they rely on rainfall, the islands. And so there's a lot of cisterns. And so there's a large part of the population that, they primarily rely on rainfall, but they're still connected to the public water system. And so during the dry season or drought, or, on the east end of St. Croix, for example, is much, much drier. It's like Colorado. And the west end is almost a rainforest. It's very, very wet. It's the difference between, maybe 15 inches, 17 inches of rain on the east end. I'm just off the top of my head, somewhere in that range, to, low 40s in the west end. So dramatic differences, and cistern use across, the island. It's fascinating, and how that then the water system responds to those difference in demands, both spatially and seasonally, and then if there's a drought or a multi-year drought, dramatically different. And so there's, and parts of the population are on the public water system, and part are on their own. They're off grid. They have their cistern, but guess what? Their cistern goes dry. So there's a whole industry of water haulers, that fill up their water trucks at the water plant and drive it to fill up the cisterns. And there's a whole industry. There's probably, there's a lot of, if you drive around St. Croix, especially in the dry season, you'll see these big trucks rolling down the road with full of water, filling up, people's cisterns. So the economics of that is fascinating. I'll just say that, you want the rainfall to come from the sky, it's,
But if you're the cistern transport guy, you don't want any rain, so you can.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
You spoke a couple of times about the financial side of things, the grant management, the funding side of things. Yeah. Explain that in regards to the Virgin Islands, or into the Virgin Islands. Like, there could be a pump that's $18,000 sold in the U.S. and let's be honest, they can't afford that out there. Or sometimes they can, or some islands can.
Yeah.
But how do you apples to apples get water pure there versus here?
It's just a lot more expensive. You're right on. I mean, getting the equipment, Miami, San Juan, are typical. It's expensive, and there's definitely cash flow situations with the utilities where they have a backup pump, and the main, the duty pump goes down, and then we just got this one, and then that one they just run and forget about, and all of a sudden they don't have any. And we need to ship the impeller to San Juan, and it's going to be 6 months. What do we do? I can tell you, the operators, that I got to know there, I work with, are the most skilled set. And you talk about adaptive management. They get it to work, I mean, they have systems go down. There's no question that, the people complain about rates, and, but what those operators and those utilities get done with the resource they have is unbelievable. Some of the stories, the best one, there's a small package plant or wastewater plant, and it serves a very small community. And this great operator, young guy, he's inventive, he understands the technology, and his aerator went down. and he knew it was it was going to be a 40, I don't know, multiple thousands of dollars. And this is a package plant that might serve 40 to 60 houses. I mean, it's small. It's a small little plant. And he was like, shoot, he calculated the cubic feet per minute he wanted, went to Home Depot, bought a big shop vac, put a pool timer on it, hooked it up. That plant's the best performing plant in the territory. I can tell you, in terms of the effluent quality, the percent reduction of nutrients, and works like a charm. And he spent a couple $100. So it's that kind of those kinds of thinking that we got to get this done, and we can't wait for this or you do, but while that system's on order, we're going to get this to work. And so there's a lot of examples like that. I mean, yes, there's some, you can find stories of, pump stations that go down and they stay down and things of that nature. But the ability for the operators to adapt and to, keep things functioning is really outstanding. It really is.
Yeah. Interesting. How are you seeing, or what have you seen out there in, I guess, in the engineering space, or even the U.S. Virgin Islands space, in regards to the silver tsunami? If you're unfamiliar, it's those who are retired from the industry and they're taking that institutionalized knowledge, and the newcomers into the industry don't know half or even an eighth of what those who are leaving the industry have, like, knowledge-wise. So what have you seen that's been able for them to pass the wisdom down, pass that knowledge down, to make sure that these plants, these communities still operate efficiently?
It can be a challenge. Institutional knowledge definitely can be a challenge. And, in the industry, if you bring in, I can think of some senior engineers in the Virgin Islands and elsewhere here in Colorado as well, but I'm thinking in the Virgin Islands. And, young engineers come in, and yeah, you're working in the islands. It's exotic and fun, but it's a big industry, and there's pay disparity. Suddenly, the senior guy retires, and the junior folks move on and move around, and yeah, there's a gap. I would say some of the systems I promote personally, but my company, Witt O'Briens, keep that in mind with respect to capturing institutional knowledge, particularly in getting back to GIS with mapping. It's so important to have not only the existing, but the history, and being able to capture the integrated social systems and land use planning with public works. It's so important because, like, to your point, the older guys know, oh, this community over here, this time of year, they're going to be generating grease like crazy or whatever, and then they retire. But if you have a maintenance log that's actually registered and has spatial, information, so when the new guy comes in and goes, oh, wow, we have to clean these, triple the frequency, these lines at this season, let's say, or whatever, I'm just making this up, but those kind of systems are really important to, and that really is some of the, I think, vision for the future, is to have smart systems, smart infrastructure systems that capture the relevant, and by relevant, it's life cycle costs, right? What is the expected life and the O&M and the manpower required to keep this functional, and capturing that, and not just guessing, and not just relying on the gray hair to say, yeah, that pump's probably about done, or that vibration of that rod that means it's gonna go. If you're logging hours on the pump or the motor, and you have a record, a smart system, that should help fill that gap. It's never going to be a replacement. And I would say that it is actually funny, in the disaster recovery space, there's a lot of retired utility people. I'll just say that, there's I'm not, my demographic is pretty common in the disaster recovery space, which I think is a good thing in general.
Yeah, you
We
kind of
bring,
need some time. Yeah.
yeah. There's a pretty. We have a meeting, and a lot of times it's 80% senior citizens.
Love it. Love it. All right. I always like to leave a space on the show for you to thank mentors that you had along your journey. And then also, I want you to give a word of inspiration and motivation, let's say to your fellow disaster recovery counterparts across the country.
All right, yeah. I mean, for sure, my two academic advisors. I mean, I was like when I said I was lost, I was particular in my, into that master's program. Professor Jim Hassett was at Syracuse Environmental Science and Forestry. He's now retired. I'm still in touch, and in fact, he winters in San Juan. So when I'm down in the Virgin Islands, I'm always pinging him about the islands and things. But he really, not just an academic mentor, but sort of gave me advice and was very patient with me in a period of time where I was really soul searching and getting my feet on the ground, and some personal and family things going on that made me think I need to do something else. And he was so understanding and helpful to me, and just the nicest guy too. But I learned a ton. And my PhD advisor at the University of Colorado Boulder, Jim Heaney, who unfortunately passed away last year, brilliant guy, completely different in many respects, but the nicest guy. Also took me under his wing. I was a little bit further in my career at that point, but was really fun with Jim Heaney was he absolutely drilled me academically, and so he gave me no quarter, both in classes and as a graduate student. And I really respected that. I grew a lot with that, because I felt secure with, in his mentorship, but he also really pushed me hard, like to the point where I was like, well, I don't know if I'm cut out for PhD. Maybe I topped out here. And then, the third one for sure was also my first boss, because Peter Maffa in Syracuse, I worked for him for 6 years as a consultant, and he was very much in the similar vein, but guided me professionally. He was brilliant. We did a lot of combined sewer overflow work, which combines, if you're not familiar, it combines stormwater and sanitary in it's sort of state-of-the-art pollution control circa 1910, but these systems are in the ground in all the Northeast. And so they're, they continue to cause water quality issues, and they're very costly, but it was a great learning experience. And Peter had a great perspective. So, and when it was time to leave and I went from Syracuse to Boulder to go to graduate school, he was nothing but encouraging. It was, he actually helped set up my, to get back into graduate school. So those three really, and the common trait amongst all three were they listened. Again, back to listening and communication. Even if maybe what I was, whatever I was spinning at the time didn't make a lot of sense, they listened to it, which was great. And in terms of motivations for the next generation, I have in my past taught graduate school at Colorado Boulder and Denver campuses in the past, probably about 10 years off and on, graduate classes. And without a doubt, the advice is exactly what I came back to earlier, which was don't stop learning. I mean, just because you get a diploma in your hand, that's the beginning of your education. Honestly, you have a lot of stuff to learn after you close that chapter. And you're going to learn from people, you're going to learn from systems, and you're going to learn, see people what to do and see people what not to do, to observe, oh, that's probably not not for me, or the way to do it. But always keep that appetite for learning, and don't get kind of stuck in the paycheck. Oh, I just got to grind out for a paycheck, and this isn't really, because that's going to end up diminishing returns. There's no question. You're going to end up 10 years down the road just saying, I got to just, and then, So continually look for opportunities to do new things. Here's the thing with, especially with consulting engineering firms, they turn the crank. They get a client relationship. There's a problem. Oh, we solved that problem for this client. We're going to do exactly the same thing, and we made money there. We're going to make more money there, and it's always like, well, we can actually improve every time we redo that. We can improve something. So let's invest in ourselves and always keep learning. And of course, there's limits to that. You always have to make business sense to keep the business going. But avoid the machine, the crank, just cranking out this, because you'll get burned out and like, I just wrote this report 10 times and here's another one.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. All right, let's say I'm coming to town. I'm coming to Vail, Colorado, and I text you ahead of time. I said, Len, where can I go to get the best burger in Vail? Where are you sending me?
Well, I honestly, would send you just past Vail, honestly.
Okay.
I love Vail, and there's great places to eat. Honestly, there really are, and I'm not, but the whole valley, we really do think in terms of the Eagle River Valley and the Gore Creek Valley combined. It's sort of euphemistically known as the Vail Valley. I would probably send you to Minturn, Colorado, which is a small community just a few miles west and southwest, but it's kind of, you got to follow down to Gore Creek, Dow Junction, get off the highway and go up. It's it's probably 15 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. And believe it or not, Rocky Mountain Taco, I would say, has the best burger, in addition to great tacos and burritos.
I hope so. Yeah.
But so it's always tough. But honestly, they're probably one of the best burgers in the valley. And if I was, in Vail, there's a bunch. I would probably, I actually like Garfinkel's, which is sort of a classic ski opera right at the base of the ski mountain, which is fun. They have big beautiful deck, and they have great refreshments and very good burgers. I would say those two would be my go-tos. Okay. And down valley, I'll give some love to Edwards and Avon. Both also have some great burger spots, but I don't know. Rocky Mountain Taco.
I'm rolling with the taco shop with the best burger. I like it.
It's making me hungry right now.
How many days a season are you on the slopes?
Oh, geez, this year was rough. It was rough because I'll do give myself a little break. I was down in the islands for a good chunk of the winter, so I missed. I probably would lucky if I hit 20 for sure. I would be. I think it wasn't up there a lot. I've been over 40, which for me is good. But this year not so much. But I'll say we do a lot of other winter sports too, cross country skiing and snowshoeing. So we're out a lot. Yeah. But I'm right now, the mountain just closed Sunday, and so we're getting the bikes out tomorrow. So there's a lot, but it's a little too muddy here in Vail, but we just go a little west down valley and everything's good. So we'll be biking tomorrow.
Good stuff. I love hearing it. I live in Peoria, Arizona now. When I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, we used to go up maybe 4 or 5 times because we're 3 hours from Tahoe. Yeah. And so we go up, a couple times a year, and that was plenty for me. But I miss it, man. I miss it. I got 3 young kids now, so it's tough to just do anything. But there will be a day you'll hear me say I did 20 days this season, which is a lot. But it's fun. It's great. I got to get back to it.
And for me, when you live here too, I am pretty focused on my work, but I will say the days I get out are really good days. There is a quality quantity trade-off, and I definitely have caught some very good days since we've lived in Vail since 2018, And
Okay.
so and we skied prior to that as well. But since moving up, I will say the days you're able to get are, you can get some
Yeah.
great days. The best is when Vail Pass closes. So, Denver can't make it over the pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That traffic coming up the mountain isn't there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, Len, once again, thanks for hopping on the podcast today. Thanks for sharing your wealth of information and knowledge with us. To all the listeners out there, make sure you share this with somebody who you think needs to hear it. Len, any final words before we get out of here?
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I love that your theme is public works. I love the video that you sent, about how you came up with the idea, and frontline workers. I didn't get into it too much, but I did a lot of field work, especially in Syracuse, in the sewers. That's why I did my background here as a sewer, an old sewer. I even though I did a lot of academic and graduate work, honestly, I should have really gotten into that more, but especially with respect to my other advice for young engineers was get in the field, actually, because you can have every equation in the book, but once you get in a manhole and you see the flow and you got to measure it, and it's not uniform flow, so I'd say I really commend you for shining a light on the public works field, the industry, and all its dimensions. And engineers, get out in the field, get your boots dirty, get the rubber boots on, get your hydrogen sulfide monitor and get down that manhole, get your confined space training. All of it is absolutely critical. Because back to the planning, you might think how things work and draw your backwater curves and your flow and hydrographs, but until you get into a flooded headworks and go, and that's all out the window, right? What's the Mike Tyson? The other planning flow, right? The Mike. Everyone's got a plan to get hit, punched in the face, right? that is 100% true in the and it doesn't have to be a huge disaster like a hurricane. It can be like a flooded headworks at a treatment plant.
Yep. 100%. Well, Len, once again, thanks for hopping on the podcast. This has been another episode of the Public Works Podcast, and thank you everybody for tuning in.
All right. Thank you.